January 17th, 1945, Western Germany, the Eifel Hills. The forest was silent in the way only winter can make it, brittle, expectant, holding its breath. Along a narrow dirt road cutting through dense pine and frozen mud, a German Wehrmacht supply column moved in cautious formation. Trucks laden with fuel drums, ammunition crates, and wounded men from the Ardennes offensive inched forward beneath skeletal branches that filtered the pale midday light into fractured shadows. The exhaust from 30 engines rose in thin gray plumes, merging with the fog that clung to the hillsides like a shroud. Inside the cabs, young soldiers, boys, really, 17 and 18, conscripted in the desperate final waves, rubbed frozen hands together and stared ahead with the vacant eyes of those who had seen too much. The convoy moved slowly, deliberately, because speed drew attention, and attention from the sky meant death. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his Kar 98K rifle wedged between his knees, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He was 21, but looked older, the kind of aging that happens not over years, but over weeks of constant fear. His orders were simple: reach the supply depot at Prüm before nightfall, avoid open ground, listen for the sound of engines. American fighter bombers had owned the skies since December, turning roads into graveyards, convoys into funeral pyres. The Luftwaffe was gone, or as good as gone. Fuel, pilots, planes, all of it bled dry by years of attrition and the relentless Allied advance. What remained of German air cover existed mostly in propaganda broadcasts and the bitter jokes of frontline soldiers. "The Luftwaffe?" they would say. "If you see a plane, it's American. If you don't see a plane, it's the Luftwaffe." Hartmann scanned the sky through the cracked windshield, his jaw tight. The road ahead bent sharply to the left, where the forest opened briefly into a clearing, a gap in the canopy no more than 50 meters wide. Dangerous, exposed. But there was no other route. The column had to pass through. Behind him, the trucks bunched closer, engines groaning under the weight of their cargo. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled thump of artillery rolled across the hills. American guns, always American guns, pounding what was left of the Wehrmacht's defensive positions. Hartmann pulled his collar tighter and muttered a prayer his mother had taught him as a child. Words he no longer believed but repeated out of habit, out of the faint hope that ritual might substitute for faith. Then he heard it. A low drone, distant but growing, like the hum of a hornet's nest, disturbed. His stomach tightened. The driver heard it too and glanced at Hartmann, eyes wide. "Jabos," he whispered, using the German slang for Jagdbombers, fighter bombers. Hartmann didn't answer. He leaned forward, peering upward through the windshield, searching the pale sky. The sound grew louder, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Behind them, soldiers began shouting, scrambling out of truck beds, diving into the roadside ditches. Officers barked orders, but the words were lost beneath the rising crescendo of that terrible engine. And then, impossibly, the plane appeared, not from above as they had expected, not diving from the clouds in the high, screaming arcs they had learned to dread. No, this one came from the side, skimming the treetops at an altitude so low it seemed to defy physics, its wings slicing through the bare upper branches with a sound like tearing fabric. It was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of American steel and firepower, painted in dull olive green with white, invasion stripes still faintly visible beneath layers of mud and exhaust stains. The plane's nose was emblazoned with a leering shark's mouth, teeth bared in predatory glee, and beneath the cockpit, someone had painted the words "Iron Ass" in jagged white letters. Hartmann's breath stopped. The plane was so low, so impossibly low, that he could see the rivets on the fuselage, the oil streaks along the cowling, the pilot's helmeted head visible through the canopy. The Thunderbolt roared over the forest like a beast unleashed, its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine howling, its propeller chewing the air into a maelstrom that bent treetops and sent dead leaves spiraling upward in its wake. For a single frozen heartbeat, the entire column stood paralyzed, staring at the apparition that had materialized from the forest itself. "Flak!" someone screamed. "Shoot! Shoot!" But the flak gunners hesitated. Mounted on the rear of the convoy's third truck was a 2 Flak 38, a quad-barreled anti-aircraft gun operated by a 4-man crew. They were trained to fire at targets above, to track planes diving from altitude, to calculate trajectories against the sky. But this was different. The Thunderbolt was below the tree line, hugging the earth, moving faster than anything that size had any right to move. The gunners swung the barrels downward, cranking the elevation wheel, but the angle was wrong, the target too low, too fast. "He's too low for Flak!" the gunner shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I can't—" The P-47's 850 caliber Browning machine guns opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling, bone-shaking brrrrt that drowned out every other noise, that made the air itself seem to vibrate. 50 caliber rounds, each one half an inch in diameter and weighing nearly 2 ounces, poured from the wings at a combined rate of 3,200 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds, every fifth bullet coated in phosphorus, streaked through the air in glowing orange lines, stitching a path of destruction across the convoy. The lead truck exploded first, fuel tanks rupturing in a blossom of orange flame that engulfed the cab and sent the vehicle careening off the road into a ditch. Hartman threw himself out of the passenger door half a second before the truck he was in disintegrated. 50 caliber rounds punching through the engine block, the windshield, the seats, the cargo bed, turning metal and wood into shrapnel. He hit the frozen ground hard, rolled, felt something hot slice across his shoulder. Behind him, the convoy was disintegrating. Trucks burst into flame one after another as the Thunderbolt raked the column from front to back, its guns tearing through steel and flesh with equal indifference. Ammunition crates exploded, sending showers of sparks and shrapnel into the air. Men screamed, burning, running, falling. The flak gun finally opened fire, its 4 barrels cycling in rapid succession, sending shells arcing uselessly into the sky as the P-47 streaked past at treetop level, already pulling up, banking hard to the right, its wingtip missing the forest canopy by inches. Hartman lay in the ditch, his face pressed into the cold mud, his ears ringing, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The entire attack had lasted perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds. And the convoy was finished. Around him, the forest was alive with the crackle of flames, the moans of the wounded, the hiss of ruptured fuel tanks. Smoke rose in thick black columns, merging with the fog, turning the winter afternoon into a twilight hellscape. He lifted his head, blinking blood out of his eyes, and looked back at the road. The Thunderbolt was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, its engine roar fading into the distance. But Hartman knew it would be back. They always came back. This was not how it was supposed to be. The boys who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1940 and 1941 had been told stories of invincibility, of blitzkrieg, of German steel and discipline crushing all opposition. They had watched newsreels of Stukas diving onto Polish cavalry, of panzers rolling through the streets of Paris, of the Luftwaffe blackening the skies over Britain. They had been taught that German engineering was superior, German tactics unmatched, German will unbreakable. For the first 2 years of the war, those stories had been, if not entirely true, at least plausible. The Wehrmacht had conquered nations in weeks, had driven the Red Army back to the gates of Moscow, had turned the Mediterranean into a German lake. But by January 1945, those stories were revealed for what they always had been: propaganda, wishful thinking, the lies that empires tell themselves as they collapse. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, had failed. The Wehrmacht had achieved initial surprise, had driven deep into American lines, had briefly rekindled the hope that Germany might still force a negotiated peace. But the offensive had stalled, bled out in the frozen forests and small towns of Belgium, ground down by American reinforcements, American artillery, and above all, American air power. When the weather cleared after Christmas, the skies had filled with Allied planes, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons, and the slaughter had begun. German columns caught in the open were annihilated. Supply routes were severed. Entire divisions were cut off, surrounded, destroyed. For soldiers like Klaus Hartmann, the war in the air was not a battle. It was an execution. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to a ghost. By early 1945, Germany was producing fewer than 1,000 planes a month, and most of those never made it off the ground. Fuel shortages meant that even operational aircraft sat idle on airfields, their tanks empty, while Allied bombers turned those same airfields into rubble. The pilots who remained were undertrained, rushed through condensed courses that gave them perhaps 30 hours of flight time before they were thrown into combat against American and British flyers who had hundreds. The result was predictable. German planes fell from the sky in droves, their pilots killed in their first or second mission, their loss barely noted in the avalanche of defeats that defined the final months of the war. And so, the skies belonged to the Allies, belonged specifically to planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was not elegant. It was not sleek or graceful. Pilots joked that it looked like a milk jug with wings, that it flew like a refrigerator, that its nickname, the Jug, was both affectionate and accurate. But what the P-47 lacked in beauty, it made up for in sheer brutal effectiveness. Weighing 7 tons empty and powered by an engine that produced 2,000 horsepower, later models pushed 2,800, the Thunderbolt could carry a heavier bomb load than many medium bombers. It was armored like a tank, its cockpit protected by thick slabs of steel and bullet-resistant glass, its engine shielded by layers of protective plating. Pilots who flew the P-47 loved it because it could take punishment that would destroy any other fighter and still bring them home. Ground troops loved it because when a Thunderbolt showed up, the enemy disappeared, either because they were dead or because they were hiding, praying the plane would pass them by. By 1945, the 9th Air Force, the Tactical Air Command supporting Allied ground forces in Europe, had over 7,500 P-47s in operation. They flew in groups, patrolling the roads and rail lines of Western Germany, hunting convoys, trains, anything that moved. Pilots called these missions armed reconnaissance, but the troops on the ground had simpler names: train busting, truck hunting, target practice. The Thunderbolts flew low, below radar, using the terrain to mask their approach. They came in fast, attacked hard, and left destruction in their wake. For the Wehrmacht, every movement became a gamble, every convoy a potential death sentence. Klaus Hartmann had not expected this. None of them had. They had expected to fight soldiers, to die in combat perhaps, but in a way that felt comprehensible, man against man, rifle against rifle. They had not expected to be hunted from the air by machines they could not fight, could not escape, could barely even see before the bullets arrived. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, who had endured Stalingrad and Kursk, broke under the constant threat of air attack. They flinched at every engine sound, dove for cover at the sight of birds in the distance. Sleep became impossible. The dread never ended. Some men deserted. Others simply stopped caring, marching down roads in broad daylight with a fatalistic resignation, daring the planes to come. And the planes always came. The pilot of Iron Ass was Captain Jake Ironside Delaney, a 24-year-old from Tulsa, Oklahoma, flying his 73rd combat mission. Delaney was not a natural pilot. He had washed out of his first flight training course in 1942, deemed too aggressive, too reckless. But a shortage of pilots had given him a second chance, and he had seized it with both hands. By January 1945, he was one of the most experienced ground attack pilots in the 362nd Fighter Group, with 16 confirmed locomotive kills, 43 truck kills, and a reputation for flying lower and faster than anyone else dared. Delaney didn't think of himself as brave. He thought of himself as lucky. He had seen friends die, good pilots, careful pilots, when a single unlucky flak burst tore through a wing, or a fuel tank ignited, or an engine seized at the wrong moment. He had learned that altitude was both safety and vulnerability. Fly high, and the flak gunners had time to aim, fly low, and they couldn't track you fast enough. So Delaney flew low, lower than the manuals recommended, lower than his squadron commander liked. So low that trees and telephone poles blurred past his wingtips. So low that German soldiers sometimes didn't realize he was a plane until the bullets were already ripping through them. That morning, Delaney's flight, 4 P-47s flying in loose formation, had been patrolling the roads east of St. Vith, hunting for targets of opportunity. The weather was marginal, low clouds, patchy fog, the kind of conditions that grounded less experienced pilots. But Delaney had learned to love bad weather. It kept the flak down, made him harder to spot. He had been flying for 90 minutes, his fuel gauge halfway down, his eyes scanning the winter landscape below, when his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. "Lead, this is 2. I've got movement, 10 o'clock, tree line." Delaney banked left, dropping lower, and saw it. A German convoy, 30 or more vehicles, creeping through the forest on a narrow road. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold focus that came with target acquisition. "All flights, this is lead. We've got a convoy, looks like supply trucks. We're going in hot. Follow my lead, watch the flak." He pushed the throttle forward, the Thunderbolt's engine roaring, and dove toward the tree line. The forest rose up to meet him, a dark green wall that filled his windscreen. He pulled the stick back at the last possible second, leveling out just above the canopy, the plane bucking as the prop wash hammered the treetops. Ahead, the road emerged from the trees, and he saw the convoy, gray trucks bunched together, soldiers visible in the backs. A flak gun on one of the rear vehicles already swinging toward him. Too slow, he thought. Too damn slow. He squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded into noise and fire. The .850 caliber machine guns fired in unison, each barrel cycling so fast that the individual shots blurred into a single continuous roar. The recoil shook the plane, the smell of cordite and gunpowder filling the cockpit. Tracers arced downward, converging on the lead truck, and Delaney saw the vehicle disintegrate, saw flame blossom, saw men running, diving, dying. He held the trigger down, walking the stream of bullets down the length of the convoy, watching trucks explode, fuel drums rupture, bodies tumble. The flak gun fired. He saw the muzzle flashes, felt the concussion of shells bursting nearby. But he was already past, already pulling up, banking hard right, his wingtips skimming the tops of the pines. "Jesus Christ, lead!" his wingman shouted. "You're gonna clip a tree one of these days." "Not today," Delaney muttered, grinning behind his oxygen mask. He pulled the Thunderbolt into a wide circle, gaining altitude, and watched as the other 3 planes made their runs, each one pouring fire into the convoy below. By the time the last P-47 pulled up, the road was a smoking ruin, the trucks burning, the forest echoing with secondary explosions. Delaney checked his fuel gauge, enough for one more pass maybe, but the convoy was finished, nothing left to shoot. "All flights, this is lead. Good kill. Let's head home." He turned west toward the Allied lines, toward the airfield at Floraine, where hot coffee and debriefing waited, and he didn't think about the men he had just killed. He thought about them later, sometimes, late at night, when the whiskey didn't work and sleep wouldn't come. But not now. Now there was only the mission, the next target, the next flight. Because if he stopped, if he let himself think too much, he knew he wouldn't be able to keep flying, and flying was the only thing that made sense anymore. For Klaus Hartmann, lying in the frozen ditch with blood soaking his uniform and smoke stinging his eyes, the attack had been a revelation, not of tactics or strategy. Those were abstractions, things discussed by officers in warm bunkers, far from the front. No, this was a revelation of something more fundamental, the understanding that he was not fighting a war. He was being crushed by an industrial machine that operated on a scale he could not comprehend, that produced planes and bombs and bullets in quantities that seemed limitless, that could afford to send 4 fighters to destroy a single convoy of trucks because there were thousands more planes where those came from. He had been told, over and over, that Germany would win because Germans were stronger, more disciplined, more willing to sacrifice. But strength and discipline meant nothing against 50 caliber bullets fired from the sky. Sacrifice meant nothing when the enemy had so many resources that losing a plane or a pilot was a rounding error in a ledger too vast to imagine. Hartmann understood, in that moment, that Germany had not lost because it lacked courage or will. It had lost because it had tried to fight an enemy that operated on a different economic and industrial plane of existence, an enemy that could outproduce, outgun, and outlast any amount of fanaticism or propaganda. The convoy, what was left of it, never reached Prüm. The survivors scattered into the forest, carrying the wounded, abandoning the burning trucks. Hartman walked west, toward the sound of artillery, toward the American lines, his hands raised above his head. He was captured 2 days later by soldiers of the 90th Infantry Division, who gave him water and a cigarette and sent him to a POW camp in France. He spent the rest of the war behind barbed wire, eating American rations, canned meat, white bread, chocolate, and marveling at the casual abundance of it all. The guards threw away leftovers that would have fed his entire platoon. They complained about the food. They complained about everything. And Hartman realized that this, too, was part of the machine, an economy so vast that even its prisoners ate better than German soldiers on the front. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew over 750,000 combat sorties in Europe during World War II. It destroyed more than 7,000 locomotives, 86,000 trucks, 9,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and thousands of other targets. It shot down nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. But the Thunderbolt's real impact was not measured in kills or sorties. It was measured in the paralysis it inflicted on the German military, the way it turned every movement into a risk, every road into a potential ambush. German units traveled only at night, only in fog, only when the weather was too bad for flying. And even then they listened for the sound of engines, that low, terrible drone that meant death was coming. The Thunderbolt was not just a weapon. It was a symbol, a 7-ton embodiment of American industrial might, of an economy that could produce 15,000 of these machines and fuel them and arm them and send them across the ocean to win a war. For the German soldiers who survived encounters with the P-47, the memory of that sound, the roar of the engine, the scream of the guns, stayed with them long after the war ended. It haunted their dreams, that low, skimming approach through the trees, that impossibly fast shape that appeared from nowhere and left only fire in its wake. Klaus Hartmann returned to Germany in 1947, to a country in ruins, a nation occupied and divided, and coming to terms with the enormity of its crimes. He rarely spoke of the war, but when he did, he told the same story: the convoy, the forest, the plane that flew too low for Flak. He told it not as a tale of heroism or tragedy, but as a statement of fact, a piece of evidence in an argument he no longer needed to make. Germany had lost because it had fought an enemy that was not just stronger, but fundamentally different, an enemy that did not rely on the courage of individuals or the brilliance of generals, but on the sheer crushing weight of industrial production. An enemy that could afford to build a plane like the Thunderbolt, ugly, brutal, unstoppable, and send thousands of them into the sky until there was nothing left to destroy. In the end, it was not a question of valor or ideology. It was a question of mathematics, and the numbers had never been on Germany's side. The sound of the P-47's engine, that low, guttural roar skimming the treetops, became a kind of metaphor for the war itself, a force of nature, impersonal and inevitable, that could not be reasoned with or fought on equal terms. You could only endure it, or run, or die. Most chose the third option without ever having a choice. And in the frozen forests of Western Germany, in the black smoke rising from burning trucks and the silence that followed the guns, a generation learned what it meant to fight a war they could not win, against an enemy they had never truly understood. The trees still stood, the road remained. But the convoy was gone, consumed by fire and .50 caliber steel, scattered into memory and ash. And somewhere over the Rhine, Captain Jake Delaney flew his Thunderbolt home, already thinking about the next mission, the next target, the next 10 seconds of controlled violence that would rewrite the calculus of war, one convoy at a time. Because that was what the P-47 did. It flew too low for Flak, too fast for fear, too relentless for hope. It flew until there was nothing left to destroy, and then it flew again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.